Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we delve into one of the great events of the 20th century, an event that has left consternation and deep inquiry, the JFK assassination. This continues to be present in the news, and most recently, President-elect Donald Trump has committed to release the information from the Warren report and related data concerning the assassination. He has also indicated that he is in favor of disclosure of the UAP information as well. The relationship between the UFO phenomenon and the JFK presidency and his assassination is something that has been emerging over recent years, most poignantly, and in fact, in the last several months, as people continue to explore evidence relating to his presidency and his killing. Danny Sheehan just spoke at the 61st anniversary event on November 22nd in Dallas at Daley Plaza. You all know Danny as the president of the New Paradigm Institute, for which I work in Washington, D.C. He is also one of the preeminent constitutional litigators of our generation, having been involved in many of the major cases shaping human rights and civil liberties in the United States. So I thought it would be appropriate for Danny to come back on Humanity Rising today in the immediate aftermath of his speech in Dallas to share with us his knowledge of the assassination and the emerging information pertaining to the UFO connection to the Kennedy administration. So, Danny, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. Danny will make a presentation, and then when he finishes his presentation, I'll circle back and we'll dialogue for the balance of the time. Thank you, Danny. Welcome.
Terrific. Thank you, guys. All right. So look, the people have probably heard that that President-elect Trump, as Jim just mentioned, has promised Robert Kennedy Jr. that Trump will release the information that is still being kept secret by the United States government pertaining to the JFK assassination back on November 22nd of 1963. He also has promised that he is going to be releasing all of the information about UFOs. Nobody is very few people are making the connection between the two things. We know that inside the new transition team, there's an awful lot of discussion about whether he is going to do either or both of those things and what the implications will be if he does. So that conversation is going on intensely in Washington, D.C. I spent a couple of hours yesterday on the phones about that into Washington. So what I want to do here this morning is I want to be able to review for you what the information is that is available now that sheds light on this for most of the people who have been focusing their attention on many other things that are going on in the world right now. The war in the Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, the threat of potential nuclear war between Russia and NATO, importantly including the United States, of course, and the repercussions of all of the different appointments that Trump is threatening to make to his cabinet and other major agencies. So there's lots of other things going on right now. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to refresh your recollection as to the importance of what happened in Dallas back in November of 1963, because it is a seminal event for the entire World War II, post-World War II baby boomer generation. That the senior members of our baby boomer generation were just like freshmen in college at that event. And then over the next period of the next 20 years, as the baby boomers were born, that the domination of the kind of political ethos by the consequences of that killing have continued to ring down through the years. The war in Vietnam being escalated after he was planning to withdraw U.S. military forces from Vietnam, and a number of other things that I'll talk about this morning. So let me give you the bullet points on this to begin with, so you can decide that you're going to stay here for the duration of the talk today, so you'll know that it's worth your while. First of all, it is true, in fact, that President Kennedy was in fact killed by a conspiracy. He was not killed by a lone gunman, some deranged individual who, for some kind of bent psychological reason, chose to kill the president, who was, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald, as they assert. But remember, it's important to know that a commission was appointed, or a special select committee was appointed by the United States Congress following the murder, which overrode the Warren Commission. And as most of you know, the Warren Commission was appointed by Lyndon Johnson, who became president upon the assassination of President Kennedy. And Lyndon Johnson appointed a multi-member commission to investigate the death, and they concluded very rapidly, and then fleshed out with a whole series of select pieces of information and some completely fabricated pieces of information, the assertion that President Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, acting all by himself, because he was basically deranged and confused young man, and that's the Warren Commission report. But what people don't realize is that the reason that a congressional committee was established to reinvestigate the killing, even after the official Warren Commission report was completed and published, was because of a series of peculiar events in history that are not widely understood. For example, the most important triggering event of the reestablishment of a congressional committee to investigate this was because of the Watergate burglary. And again, people don't logically make the connection between the two, but it's important that we do, because historically what happened is that the assassination took place in 1963. The Warren Commission was appointed basically at the very end of 1963. It issued its report a year later, and it was a year after that the books started coming out, evaluating the Warren Commission and pointing out major flaws in it. But the books began to come out, and more people began to suspect that the Warren Commission was not only not accurate, but that it was part of a conscious cover-up of the assassination. But this went on from 1964 all the way up to 1968, and Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, following, as you'll recall, some of you, in 1968, in April, Martin Luther King was assassinated. In June of 1968, Robert Kennedy Sr. was assassinated. And there was a lot of turmoil in the country opposing the war in Vietnam. There was a huge demonstration against the war at the Democratic Convention in June of 1968 in Chicago. And then there was this intense campaign that went on in 1968 with Richard Nixon winning by just about 1% of the vote against Hubert Humphrey. But what happened is during that whole first term of Richard Nixon from 1968 to 1972, the events around the Vietnam War dominated the scene. But what happened is in 1972, during the re-election campaign of Richard Nixon, running for his second term in office, in June, on June 17th of 1972, a burglary took place in Washington, D.C., in Democratic National Headquarters. And 5 men were arrested in the hotel, in the offices of the Democratic National Committee, in the middle of the night, burglarizing the offices. And an additional 2 men were arrested later, for being directly involved in it. So there were 7 people that were arrested. And what happened is, following the huge scandal around the Watergate burglary, there was a special select committee set up in the House and Senate to investigate the Watergate burglary. And as a result of the Watergate hearings in the Congress, immediately following the conclusion of the Watergate burglary investigation, which it was determined that Richard Nixon had been directly involved in ordering the cover-up of that burglary, and that the people who committed the burglary were functioning for the committee to re-elect President Nixon. The bottom line is, after the conclusion of the Watergate hearings, immediately there was set up a Senate Select Committee to investigate the misconduct of the Central Intelligence Agency. And it was revealed in that set of hearings that the Central Intelligence Agency had been engaged in a systematic program of political assassinations around the world. And because of that conclusion, and the realization that of the 7 people that were involved in the Watergate burglary, 6 of them were intimately involved with the Central Intelligence Agency. And so there was a reinvestigation of the assassination of President Kennedy in light of these discoveries. And that House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that, contrary to the findings of the Warren Commission, the evidence made it clear that it was much more probable than not that President Kennedy had been murdered and assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. And that the people that were the likely suspects in that conspiracy to kill the president were a certain element of organized crime and a certain element of Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban activists. Okay, so that's the setting for what we're talking about. That what I'll do today is I will explain to you who those people were, and why they killed the president, how that happened, but very importantly, why that actually happened, as distinct from what people might think. And then I will explain, of course, the role of Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'll also then touch upon this extremely important issue that Jim has raised, of its relationship to the UFO issue. Okay, so the bottom line, let's start at the top of this. The bottom line is that the president was assassinated in Dealey Plaza, not by 1 gunman, not by 2 gunmen, and not even by 3 gunmen. It was an entire 15-man special assassination squad that had been created back in 1960, which is 3 years earlier. What had happened in 1960 was that Richard Nixon was the vice president at that time under Dwight D. Eisenhower, they both had served 2 terms. And during that 8-year period, from 1952 to 1960, Richard Nixon has served in his capacity as the vice president, as the chair of a group called the 5412 Committee, which was a subcommittee of the National Security Council that sits in the White House, made up of the head of the CIA, the head of the defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the FBI, the National Security Advisor people, et cetera. And the bottom line is that what had happened in June of 1960, as soon as, in that case, Nelson Rockefeller, who was a competitor to Richard Nixon for the Republican Party nomination for the presidency in 1960, as soon as Nelson Rockefeller withdrew from the primary race in the state of Michigan, as it turns out, as soon as he withdrew, Richard Nixon knew that he was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. And he was completely confident that he was going to defeat the young Democratic Party nominee, John F. Kennedy. And so what Richard Nixon did, Richard Nixon got on the telephone, the secure phone of the 5412 Committee, and contacted a consultant for the National Security Council, Howard Hughes, the kind of recluse billionaire that was living in the penthouse of one of the major casinos in Las Vegas, owned by the mafia. There were 3 major casinos that were owned by the mafia in Las Vegas at that time: the Sands, the Desert Inn, and the Flamingo. And it was in the Desert Inn, I think, that Howard Hughes was living. But he was secretly functioning as a consultant to the National Security Council under the chairmanship of Richard Nixon, the vice president at that time. So Richard Nixon contacted Howard Hughes by phone, the secure phone, and asked Howard Hughes to set up an assassination team to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara, the leaders of the new revolutionary government in Cuba that had been defying Richard Nixon in the Eisenhower administration by agreeing to establish diplomatic relations with both the Soviet Union and China, which the Eisenhower-Nixon administration opposed. And when Fidel Castro defied them and set up international relations with both the Russians and the Chinese, the Central Intelligence Agency, under the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council, mounted a covert war against Cuba, a paramilitary war, and the CIA set up 5 paramilitary bases in the southeastern United States, one on Swan Island off the coast of Florida, one on No Name Key in Florida, one in the Everglades in Florida, and 2 over in Louisiana on Lake Pontchartrain, one on the northern end and one on the southern end. These 5 paramilitary bases were staffed by anti-Castro Cuban refugees that had fled from Cuba in January of 1959 when the revolutionary government had overthrown Batista, the fascist dictator of Cuba. And these men were recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency under the supervision of Richard Nixon as the chair of the Covert Operations Committee of the National Security Council. And these people were engaged in a project codenamed Operation 40 that were invading in small groups into Cuba, burning sugar fields, blowing up bridges, poisoning sugar shipments in ships, et cetera, to try to uproot and destroy the economy of Cuba. All of this, it was going on, and it was done at the specific direction of Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, as I said, in June of 1960, when he knew that he was going to be the Republican nominee and presumed president, next president, he contacted Howard Hughes and asked Hughes to set up an assassination team to assassinate the leadership, the revolutionary leadership of Cuba. And he said, keep this completely away from the White House. It cannot ever be connected to me or to the White House. So you have to set it up independently. So what Howard Hughes did was, without agreeing that he would or would not do this at the request of then Vice President Richard Nixon, he brought in one of his lawyers, Robert Mayhew, and tasked Robert Mayhew with getting this to happen, to get an assassination team put together to assassinate the leadership of the Cuban revolutionary government. Robert Mayhew went and met with a fellow by the name of Johnny Roselli, who was the bagman in Las Vegas for the mob, working under Sam Giancana from Chicago. The bottom line is Robert Mayhew contacted John Roselli and said, look, you guys in the mafia have your own reasons for wanting to get rid of Fidel Castro and his government in Cuba. He shut down all of your casinos. He shut down all of the houses of prostitution that you had going there. And very importantly, he shut down heroin trafficking that was coming in out of Southeast Asia. And that you have your own reasons for wanting to get rid of them. So would you please check with your people and get them to set up an assassination team? Because the new incoming president, Richard Nixon, wants that to happen. So what happened is, bottom line is, they ended up meeting with Sam Giancana to get him to agree to do this. Then they went down to Florida in July and late July of 1960 and met at the Fontainebleau Hotel there with Santos Trafficante. And in that meeting was Sam Giancana, Bob Mayhew from Howard Hughes's office, and Johnny Roselli. And they went down to the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, and they met with Santos Trafficante, who was the Don of the mafia in Havana earlier and had fled up to Tampa, Florida. They had the meeting there, and after 2 full meetings, Santos Trafficante agreed in principle to set up such an assassination team, but he wanted to make certain that this wasn't just the idea of Howard Hughes or even Bob Mayhew. He wanted to make sure that this was coming from what they kept referring to as the president with Nixon. And so in the 3rd meeting, a man came to the meeting using the nom de guerre, Mr. Ed, and his real name is Sheffield Edwards, who was the chief of security for the Central Intelligence Agency under the Eisenhower-Nixon administration. And he gave the green light for putting together this assassination team. Now, this assassination team became operational before the election of 1960, but much to everyone's shock and surprise, Richard Nixon did not win the election in 1960. John F. Kennedy won the election, and he was not told about the existence of this assassination team that had been set up by Richard Nixon in coordination with Santos Trafficante. So the bottom line is that this assassination team kept going forward in these military bases, these paramilitary bases down in the Everglades and in Florida and in Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana, kept on functioning covertly without the knowledge to begin with of either John Kennedy as president or Robert Kennedy as the Attorney General. And what happened is, very soon after John Kennedy took office in January of 1961, he was told about the fact that there was a planned invasion on the part of these paramilitary forces in the CIA to invade the island of Cuba. And John Kennedy, the new president, refused to provide any military support for that or any air cover for such attempted invasion. He was very clear about that. But the CIA went forward to attempt this invasion, and they were trapped on the beach at the Bay of Pigs, and they were all basically either killed or taken as prisoners by the Cuban revolutionary government. And there's a feeling that people have around the country that because the Cuban refugees and the Cuban exiles were so furious at Kennedy for not providing the air cover for them that they hated him and wanted to kill him. It turns out that is not entirely true. Kennedy had been very clear from the very beginning that he was never going to provide air cover, and he was never going to allow military forces to be applied. And so his refusal to do so in extremis, when the Cuban exiles landed on the beach and tried to then talk him into supporting them, ex post facto, he refused to do it. And so therefore, and very importantly, he at that point took responsibility for it, because it was a huge public scandal, because they were all arrested and the Cuban government revealed who they were, and they were directly working with the CIA. And so John Kennedy went down to Florida and the Orange Bowl and apologized to all the exile community down there and promised them that the free flag of Cuba would be flying over the island before the end of his second term. And they more or less accepted that. And he also, John Kennedy, lied to Khrushchev, the President Khrushchev, or Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, and asserted that he would no longer, Kennedy would no longer allow any of these paramilitary attacks to go on against the island of Cuba. But all they did is change the code name for the operation from Operation 40 to Operation Mongoose. And John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were both cognizant of and supportive of the continued paramilitary operations against the island of Cuba. And because of that, Khrushchev was angered by being lied to by John Kennedy. And so he started moving missiles, nuclear missiles, into Cuba, which generated the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. And it was that Cuban Missile Crisis that becomes the key to this, because the world came to within minutes, literally within minutes, of a total thermonuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States over the fact that the United States was imposing this major embargo on the island of Cuba and threatened to seize or sink ships of Russia if they tried to bring any more missiles into the island of Cuba or did not disassemble them. The bottom line is, because John Kennedy and Khrushchev were so totally traumatized by how close they came to a total thermonuclear exchange, that the two men began engaging in a series of totally secret letters, exchange of letters. Some 18 letters were shared back and forth between John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. A man by the name Norman Cousins carried these letters back and forth, and the content of these letters has never been publicly revealed. But the bottom line is that what was happening is John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev were agreeing between themselves that it was so horrible what had happened about coming so close to a total thermonuclear war, that they both agreed that they were going to start exercising their respective authority as the chief executives of their respective countries to actively disassemble the nuclear warheads of both of their nuclear arsenals and to destroy the warheads. And in replacement of this long, intense, highly expensive war, a Cold War that was going on between the two countries for all those years, from 1947 basically through 1964, excuse me, 62 rather. That what happened is they were agreeing to disassemble and destroy the nuclear warheads. And that what they were going to do is to substitute now, instead of that kind of Cold War dynamic between the United States and the Soviet Union, Kennedy and Khrushchev were planning to have a joint US-Soviet space program, that they were going to be going into space together as a combined humanity. And that's what they were planning to do. And what happened on June 5th of 1963, now this is like 6 months or 7 months after the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, what happened is John Kennedy had ordered the shutting down of the 5 paramilitary bases that I identified earlier, and ordered the Cuban refugees to stand down and cease and desist from their continued paramilitary operations against the island of Cuba. And so the bottom line is the refugees or the exiles that were engaged in those activities under the direction of the Central Intelligence Agency for so many years were furious with Kennedy. And in fact, one of them, Frank Sturgis, who was the CIA liaison for the Cuban exiles that were out on No Name Key, defied the president and actually launched another secret attack on a Russian ship that was in the harbor in Havana, Cuba, and sank the ship and actually attacked another ship, another Russian ship. And President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, were so furious about the defying of that and threatening the agreement that was made now with Kennedy and Khrushchev to cease and desist from these activities around Cuba, that what happened is President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, mounted a military assault against No Name Key, where Frank Sturgis, the CIA guy, had been coordinating these exiles. And 6 helicopter gunships manned by U.S. Marshals, and went in and burnt out the base at No Name Key and arrested the Cuban exiles that were there and charged them with a violation of the Neutrality Act, the Federal Neutrality Act that prohibits American citizens from engaging in any kind of paramilitary activities against a country with whom we have no declared war. So the bottom line is that those people were arrested. They were released within a week, and charges were dropped. But it was a signal to those Cuban exiles that they were to cease and desist from this. But in fact, the second group of them over in the Everglades, under the supervision of CIA agent E. Howard Hunt, started planning a second attack against the island of Cuba. And John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy sent in the same 6 helicopter gunships with U.S. Marshals and burnt out the base in the Everglades. It was at that point that the Cuban exiles, who were part of this assassination team that had been based on those 5 different paramilitary groups, they came together and resolved that they wanted to kill President Kennedy and Bob Kennedy, Robert Kennedy too, for they viewed them as traitors to the cause of the Free Cuba movement. But the fact is, they didn't have the authority to do it. They didn't dare do it because they knew that they couldn't get away with it. But they wanted to do this. And on June 5th, John Kennedy found out from Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, that the assassination team that had been put in place secretly by Richard Nixon back in 1960, 3 years earlier, was still operational and trying to kill Fidel Castro and mainly Che Guevara. And so he ordered them to stand down from that. And at the same time, on June 5th of 1963, he contacted the CIA and others and demanded to have given to him all of the information that we had about the UFO phenomenon and about the potential existence of an extraterrestrial species that was coming and going from our planet in these UFOs, because he was going to share that information with Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of Russia, because he wanted to show as a sign of good faith that they could join together in a joint space program going out into space together to encounter the extraterrestrial civilization, and that was what he planned to do. And the CIA and others absolutely refused to give the information to Kennedy. And very importantly, then they discovered that Kennedy was, in fact, engaged in these secret communications with Khrushchev. on June 5th. And so the bottom line is that there was a decision made at that point that they discovered that he was planning to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the United States nuclear arsenal in exchange for the Russians agreeing to do the same with Nikita Khrushchev. And at that point, a decision was made that they were going to loose the assassination team, it was codenamed the S-Force, to allow them to go forward to assassinate the president because they couldn't wait until the next election in November of 1964, an entire year later, because during that 1 year period, Kennedy would have been able to give the orders to start disassembling the nuclear warheads of the American nuclear arsenal in exchange for the Russians doing the same. This is an extraordinarily important piece of information for people to know, to understand that the level at which the decision was made to assassinate President Kennedy was at a very high level among the people that could not tolerate the disassembly of the nuclear arsenal of the United States government. This is a group called the China Lobby. This is the group that believed that the future of the economic development of the United States was going to focus on developing the economic resources of Asia. This is the same group, not to get too complicated here, but it's the same group that resided at a place called Brown Brothers Harriman. It's a private investment firm in New York that had been operational for decades, and it was made up of the main robber baron families that had arisen during the robber baron era here in the United States between the end of the Civil War in 1868 and 1898 with the election of President McKinley. This is the rise of the robber barons is an actual period in history. In high school civics, you learn that this is the age of the robber barons. And it opened onto in 1893, actually, into the era of the American imperialism. It's also called that in the American civil studies, civil, what we call it, the civics. That's it, high school civics courses. You know that the robber baron era took place. These families rose into power, and then they pushed the federal government into engaging in imperialist ventures to secure control over the economic resources in the Pacific. For example, they overthrew the island of Hawaii and Guam and were moving on across the Pacific Ocean. And that is the same group which, in fact, funded the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich in Germany. They secretly funded that operation in order to establish Germany in Europe as the bulwark against Bolshevism. Because at the end of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution had arisen in Russia and had ousted Tsar Nicholas II and had replaced the Tsarist right-wing authoritarian government in Russia with the new Bolshevik revolutionary government. This is something that the people at Brown Brothers Harriman, who wanted to develop the economic resources of China, they were totally opposed to this. And the bottom line is they had come to rely upon the existence and operation of our nuclear arsenal because they knew perfectly well that they could not take on China in a traditional land war. That had been demonstrated to them in Korea in the 1950s, when China sent tens of thousands of troops into the Korean Peninsula and drove back the United States forces that were operating under the rubric of the UN at that point. But it was overwhelmingly dominated by the United States military in the Korean War. So that this is the actual reason why this S-Force was green-lighted by Allen Dulles, who had become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency earlier, because he was legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, this private investment group, the CEO of whom was George Herbert Walker, who was the grandfather, the maternal grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush, and the great-grandfather of George Walker W. Bush. This is the crowd that was nested in Brown Brothers Harriman that played such a dominant role. They and their law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. This is the seat of the China lobby, who would not tolerate John Kennedy disassembling the nuclear arsenal of the United States, on which they had come to depend to be able to push forward U.S. military power in economic domination in the world. And so that is who assassinated the president. It was a 15-man assassination unit. They were deployed throughout Dealey Plaza. There are photographs of different ones of these people. There's Rip Robertson. William Rip Robertson there's a photograph of him standing next to the Simmons freeway sign, tipping his hat to the president, just 1.2 seconds before the first shot rang out. The Edward Lansdale has been photographed there, confirmed and identified by his own wife there in interviews that we had conducted. So the bottom line is we know that this is what happened, and who it was that assassinated him. It was the S-Force, the 15-man S-Force made up of Cuban American exiles from the island of Cuba that were rabid anti-communist and anti-Castro elements that had been supporters of Batista, the previous authoritarian president of Cuba. And they were green-lighted not only by Allen Dulles, who had become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but who had been fired actually in November of 1961 by Kennedy. But the bottom line is, it was in his capacity as the consigliere, basically, for the Brown Brothers Harriman. It was in that capacity that he did it. Now, this was also, as you can tell from the brief description I've given of it, that it was also, they were involved with the mafia in setting up that assassination group, because Santos Trafficante, when he agreed with Howard Hughes to set up the assassination team, he chose to be on that assassination team Cuban exiles who had been recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to engage in this covert operations against Cuba called Operation 40. So he knew that if they had gotten caught in the attempt to assassinate Castro, they could get the Central Intelligence Agency to have to come in and cover for them, because they were also employees of the CIA. So this is how the actual events happened. And now the question that arises that people are going to immediately ask, okay, is that yes, there was a gunman on the grassy knoll. Yes, there was a gunman in the Daltex building behind the president, and there was in fact a shooter, actually two shooters, in the book depository. But surprisingly and stunningly, I'm sure to most of you, one of them was Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was deeply involved with all of these forces, hardcore right-wing forces. That he was an active member of a thing called Field Operations Intelligence. It was a private domestic political surveillance operation made up largely of former U.S. military intelligence operatives, which you now realize Oswald was from the time that he was at the U-2 base in Japan, that he had been trained down at Nag's Head in North Carolina into a program where he would pretend to be a left-wing Marxist, disgruntled American serviceman who then went to Russia and renounced his citizenship and was engaged in attempting to spy on not only the Soviet Union, but he was also involved in spying on left-wing forces when he came back from Russia. So the bottom line is that Lee Harvey Oswald, however, He was, in fact, a patsy because he thought that what his job was to do was to pretend to be a left-wing activist and a supporter of Cuba and the Cuban revolutionary government in setting up that group called Fair Play for Cuba in New Orleans. But he was working very closely with hardcore right-wing paramilitary people, Guy Bannister, the head of the Central American World Anti-Communist League, David Ferry, and the right-wing elements around New Orleans, who were in fact providing weapons to the paramilitary base at Lake Pontchartrain, at the north end of Lake Pontchartrain. Lee Harvey Oswald has been identified by numerous people as being actively involved in helping with the team that was supplying weapons to the anti-Castro Cuban forces in the northern base at Lake Pontchartrain. And he was deeply involved with all of those people. And what happened is he was tasked to pretend to be a left-wing pro-Cuban supporter who was going to, from the Texas Book Depository, where he was placed by Ruth Page and others who were hardcore right-wing white Russians, actually. The bottom line is that he thought he was going to take a shot at the motorcade as it passed the book depository, and then he was going to try to escape. But even if he got caught, he would leave a trail one way or another that it was someone who was a supporter of the Cuban government. And therefore, they were going to use it as a rationale, the hardcore right-wing forces, to pressure the government of the United States to have to invade Cuba. Again, that was their obsession. And the bottom line is, when Lee Harvey Oswald showed up and fired the single shot, the initial shot at the motorcade, which hit the curb and didn't even touch any vehicle, the instant that he fired that shot, additional firing took place from people that he didn't even know were there, in my judgment. That the triangular fire team of the S-Forces had been deployed. He was not a member of the S-Force, the secret assassination team that had been created by Richard Nixon. But the bottom line is, the instant that those other shots rang out and killed the president, Lee Harvey Oswald realized that he'd been set up, and that he thought he was just going to fire one shot at the motorcade but not hit anybody, and then either escape and leave a trail behind him of being a left-wing Cuban supporter, or even if he got caught, he was going to be represented and be able to eventually get released. Okay, so the bottom line is, this is what actually happened, and this is the only way in which the UFO issue was involved, because President Kennedy, in his secret exchange of letters with Khrushchev, was going to be creating this joint U.S.-Soviet space program, and he wanted to demonstrate the good faith because they were so traumatized, Khrushchev and Kennedy. He wanted to show the extreme good faith that Kennedy, was repentant for having lied about it earlier to Khrushchev after the Cuban invasion at the Bay of Pigs, and he wanted to compensate for that. So he was trying to get the UFO information that he knew the government had to turn over to Nikita Khrushchev, and that was not the reason that he was killed. It was because he was planning to disassemble the nuclear arsenal and the warheads of the U.S. nuclear arsenal in exchange for the Soviet Union doing the same. So you can see where people would be confused in thinking, oh, he must have been killed because he was trying to get the UFO information. That's not true. It was just in accompanying his desire to establish the joint space program with the Soviet Union that he asked to get the UFO information as a sign of good faith. And you can also see why people would be confused in thinking that Lee Harvey Oswald was a patsy and that he was somehow just innocent and wasn't involved in the assassination. He wasn't involved in the assassination itself. He was just attempting to fake an assassination attempt and to generate enough hostility toward Cuba to support the CIA invasion of Cuba. So this is what I presented to the Lancer group down in Dealey Plaza this past November 22nd. This is the reality. Now, fortunately, this is recorded, so you'll be able to replay it because this is sort of like a drink out of a fire hose here for you. It's a lot of information that some of what you probably have heard, but most of it you haven't. But that's how this happened. That's who did it. And of course, the massive cover-up that took place immediately after the event, because the people who knew about the existence of this S-Force, this assassination team, realized what had happened. And so they moved immediately to try to conceal this because they were all horrified that if, in fact, it became clear that the Central Intelligence Agency was involved in creating the assassination team that had killed the president, if they realized that the authority for them to function and to kill the president had come from Allen Dulles, who was the former CIA director, that people would then believe that it was our United States government that had actually killed the president, which in a way it was. But it was the deep government, the secret government that resided at Brown Brothers Harriman and in this China lobby that were really the people behind the scenes who were pulling the strings on a lot of the foreign policy of the American government and the military policy and the maintenance of this massive thermonuclear arsenal that the United States deploys. Okay, so this is what happened. Now, bottom line, in closing, I'll just point out that this is exactly what happened. Why were the people that were in the Watergate Hotel, why in the world were they these three Cuban gunmen from Traficante's team who were part of the S-Force, the Cubans, and why were they being supervised by E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, who were the liaison from the CIA to their respective paramilitary bases? And the answer to that is this, in closing. It turns out that they were in the Watergate Hotel to wiretap and bug the phones and to bug the office of Larry O'Brien. Larry O'Brien had just recently been made the new head of the Democratic National Committee to run the 1972 Democratic Party campaign against Richard Nixon in the presidential race. And it turns out that Larry O'Brien, prior to being made the head of the Democratic National Committee in 1972, had been for 20 years the chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes. And Richard Nixon, the minute that he realized that Larry O'Brien had been made the new head of the Democratic National Committee, Richard Nixon was terrified that O'Brien may have been told by Howard Hughes that it was Richard Nixon who actually set up the assassination team that was put together to kill Fidel Castro, which in fact is the team that actually killed the president. And Richard Nixon knew that if anything leaked out about that, there was no way during the 1972 political campaign that he was going to be able to convince people that he was not knowledgeable about or even implicated in authorizing the assassination of President Kennedy, because it was the very team that he had created in order to be created back in June of 1960. Okay, so what happened is when the famous smoking gun conversation took place on June 23rd of 1972, following the June 17th burglary, that H.R. Bob Haldeman, who was the chief of staff for Richard Nixon, came into the Oval Office. These are on the tapes, the White House office tapes. He came into the Oval Office and he said, "Mr. President, I think we've got a problem." And Nixon said, "What is it, Bob?" And he said, "Well, L. Patrick Gray, who's the new head of the FBI, has reached out to John Dean, the presidential legal counsel, and said that people at the highest levels of the FBI have found sequentially numbered $100 bills, initially in the jacket pocket of Bernard Barker, one of the burglars in the Watergate Hotel. But other of the burglars that were arrested had these sequentially numbered $100 bills on their person, and were later found in their hotel room at the Watergate Hotel. And the top officials in the FBI, specifically Mark Felt, who was the deputy director of the FBI, tracked these bills back to an account in Mexico City, the Banco Internacional, in the account of an attorney by the name of Manuel Ogario. And he, Mark Felt, the number 2 man in the FBI, was getting set to fly to Mexico City on June 24th of 1972 to check out that bank account. And it turns out that that is the bank account through which was funded the political assassination team training base that trained this S-Force group down in Oaxaca, Mexico, on the ranch of down in Mexico, a ranch down there. And that's the money that was skimmed off the casinos in Las Vegas. And part of that money was deposited in the bank account down in Banco Internacional in Mexico City to fund the Triangular Fire Team base, training base down in Oaxaca, Mexico. And so when Bob Haldeman came into the office and said, "Mr. President, I think we got a problem," that L. Patrick Gray, the new FBI director, has contacted John Dean, legal counsel, and said, "Look, the highest ranking people in the FBI are now getting set to want to go down and investigate this bank in Mexico City where these bills were tracked to in the pockets of the Watergate burglars." And Richard Nixon said, "Bob, you've got to go get John Ehrlichman right now, and you and Ehrlichman go over to the CIA over at Langley, and you talk to Dick Helms and Vernon Walters, the director and deputy director of the CIA, and you get them to contact the FBI right away and order them to get out of that part of the investigation." And Bob Haldeman said, "Well, what am I supposed to tell them to say?" He said, "You just tell Dick Helms and Vernon Walters that if they don't get out of that part of the investigation, i.e. the bank in Mexico City and that bank account where the $100 bills came from that were in the pockets of the Watergate burglars, if you don't get that stopped, all the stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys in Mexico could come out." and Bob Ehrlichman said, "Well, will they know what I'm talking about? Will they know what that means?" And Richard Nixon said, "Yes, they'll definitely know what that means." And when Bob Haldeman was asked in the Watergate hearings, in the House and Senate joint Watergate hearings by Senator Sam Ervin, what in the world did that mean? When he said that if you don't stop that in part of the investigation, all the stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys is going to come out. And H.R. Haldeman said under oath, "I believe he was talking about the assassination of President Kennedy." And there was a dead silence fell over the room in the Watergate hearings, and then they went on to another subject. But the fact is, that's what the story is. That's what the explanation for the smoking gun explanation is. And that's that led to the impeachment resolutions being presented to the House Judiciary Committee against Richard Nixon, and that's why he resigned. So this is the story of the actual assassination of President Kennedy, the peculiar role of Lee Harvey Oswald, the role of the cover-up that went on with the Warren Commission, the fact that the House Select Committee on Assassinations actually came to the conclusion that the president had probably been killed as a result of a conspiracy, and that the most likely suspects were a certain element of organized crime, that is Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana, as mentioned, in Johnny Roselli. and certain elements of the anti-Castro Cuban exile community in Miami. And that is, of course, the S-Force, the 15 Cuban refugees or exiles who were part of the assassination team that had been created by Richard Nixon back in 1960. So that's the drink from the fire hose. I had to be done in 1 hour. That was the time limit I was given down in Dealey Plaza. And so that's basically a review of what it is that I provided to them.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much. Listen, just two questions just to follow up. One, in your knowledge, how extensive was the awareness that the assassination was going to take place? So, for example, in your view, did Richard Nixon know? Did J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, know? Did Lyndon Johnson know? Who held that information?
This is a remaining question. There are two witnesses who assert, and that I have not come to the conclusion for certain that it's true, but there are two separate witnesses, eyewitnesses, that assert that on the night before the assassination, that would be on the evening of November 21st of 1963, that a meeting was held in Texas, out in Dallas, at the ranch of what was his name? Anyway, it was the ranch owned by the same family that owned the ranch down in Oaxaca, Mexico, where the Triangular Fire Team base was actually trained. And they have the big home in Dallas. They were the owners of the Dallas Texan football team. In fact, the two witnesses, a woman who was the maid at the house, and in fact, one of the people who was the driver for the family, said that there was a gathering at that home, and Richard Nixon was there. He was in town under the cover of delivering a speech in Dallas that day at the Pepsi-Cola company, of which he was a member of the stockholder. And Lyndon Johnson was there, of course, because he was in the motorcade the next day. J. Edgar Hoover was said to be there by both of those witnesses. And the woman who was the mistress of Lyndon Johnson was there. And she has asserted that she was there. So there are three witnesses, actually, the housemaid, the driver, and the mistress of Lyndon Johnson, who was there, and said that when they went into the back room and they came out and they were all very sullen, and Lyndon Johnson turned to her and said, after tomorrow, we're not going to have any more problems with Kennedy. And so that's all we know. I don't know for certain that that's true. We haven't put the people on a PSE, a psychological stress evaluator, which would be the main way that you test a thing like that. All of those people are deceased now, and so that it's not clear how. I mean, obviously, Allen Dulles knew about it. It appears that there were three other people at the highest levels of the Central Intelligence Agency that knew about it. William D. Pauley knew about it. He was a hardcore right-wing guy. He was one of the funders, along with Hunt, not E. Howard Hunt, but the multi-billionaire Hunt from Texas, in funding the Field Operations Intelligence, which was the domestic political spying group that Lee Harvey Oswald was a part of. So that there were several people that knew that the green light had been turned on for the S-Force to kill the president, who themselves, as I mentioned, had their own reason for wanting to kill the president. And so that they deployed They first tried to kill him in Miami. They planned to do it, but then he didn't go to Miami. And then they tried to assemble to kill him in Chicago. But then there was intelligence gotten that there was a threat on the president in Chicago, so he didn't go there. And Dallas was the third place where they assembled.
Really?
Yes,
Oh,
there were
wow.
three different gatherings to try to kill him, but they finally killed him in Dallas. Okay, so that's what happened, and that's what we know.
Let me just ask a final question around the relationship between the sort of the deep state that organized the assassination and the cover-up
Yes.
with the deep state that has organized the secrecy and the cover-up of the UFO UAP phenomenon. Is it your understanding that they're conflated? Were they different aspects of the same sort of octopus? Because you have the same sort of misdeeds, extensive cover-up,
Hmm.
and secrecy that, like with JFK and UAP, exists to the present day. And each president who's had the opportunity to disclose, in the end, has decided not to. So that
Yes.
deep state apparatus and power still exists. So speak to that.
That is true. Now, this, of course, was codified in the National Security Act of 1947 that was enacted by Congress under the administration of President Truman. And President Truman had, it's quite interesting. President Truman, in December of 1945, came to know about the existence of these 176 troves of treasure that had been buried in the Philippines by the Japanese government when they realized that there was probably going to be an allied invasion of the island of Japan, the islands. And so they moved the major treasure of the Japanese government out of Japan into the Philippines. And 12 of these 176 troves was discovered by actually Ed Lansdale, who's photographed in Dealey Plaza on the day of the killing. And they recovered 12 of these troves for with the amount of $1.2 trillion in gold and platinum and silver bars and big 50-gallon drums of diamonds and rubies. And they stored these away. They told President Truman about the discovery. President Truman authorized that treasure to be the 12 troves of this to be taken out of the Philippines and put into the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland. And they issued gold certificates off that deposit in that bank and used that to put into place all throughout Europe at the end of World War II right-wing elements that were supportive, actually, of the Nazis in this weird alliance that was established at the end of World War II between the OSS, the Office of Special Services, the predecessor of the CIA, and the remnant forces of the Third Reich as an anti-communist bulwark, which turns out to have been overseen and supervised by the same people that at the front end had actually financed the rise of Hitler out of Brown Brothers Harriman, that set up the Union Bank of New York. The investors in Brown Brothers Harriman capitalized the Union Bank of New York. They set up a foreign subsidiary up in the Netherlands called the Bank of Shipping and Commerce. A man by the name of Fritz Dyson ran that for them. And they financed out of that bank in the Netherlands the construction of the international headquarters of the Third Reich and financed the rise of Hitler to try to reestablish the military power of Germany at the end of World War I so as to be able to function as in their term, bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. While the people at Brown Brothers Harriman who funded that entire operation, those robber baron families, turned their eyes westward across the Pacific to try to get into Asia and to develop the resources of Asia. And so that's the seat of power. Sullivan and Cromwell was that law firm for Brown Brothers Harriman. Sullivan and Cromwell and Brown Brothers Harriman, between the periods of about 1918 all the way on up through to 1963, were the seat of power in the United States government that actually secretly funded operations around the world. They were two of the senior partners of Brown Brothers Harriman were appointed by President Truman to run the secret trust that ran those funds in the International Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, and it was Robert Lovett and Anderson, the two of them. The third trustee was John J. McCloy. There was Robert Anderson, Robert Lovett, and John McCloy. They were the three trustees of the what they call Anderson Trust, or the Black Eagle Trust. They referred to it as. But anyway, it had $1.2 trillion of value in it, and that was with gold at $32 an ounce. And gold now is like $1,400 an ounce or something like that. So you can see the scale of the funds that were there. So that whole covert operation was going on behind the scenes, and they set up that Anderson Trust in December of 1945. What happened is within 2 years, in July of 1947, with the Roswell crash that occurred and the recovery of the UFO there, Truman, when he was notified about that, he duplicated what they had done earlier in December of 1945. He set up a completely independent group outside of the oversight of the Congress or the United States constitutional government. And they set up a thing which is codenamed Majestic 12. There were 12 men that were appointed by Truman to oversee the handling of the UFO issue as the deepest secret that the United States government had. And shortly thereafter, the National Security Act of 1947 was passed. And so they set up this entire structure of classified information, secrecy being withheld, not only from the American people, under the theory that we can't tell the American people because then our enemies will know, but the whole concept that there was this group of enemies that we had, even though the war was over, that all of a sudden they declared themselves to be in opposition to the Soviet Union and to any other country that basically supported socialism at that point. In the Truman Doctrine, the famous Truman Doctrine was that we cannot allow the reins of the governments of any country in Europe to fall into the hands of socialists, even if it is the will of the majority of their own people. And there you had it. That was the Truman Doctrine. That was the national security state mentality. The national security state was set up through the National Security Act of 1947. And since that time, our country has been governed by a national security state. And that there are two forces that are elements there. One is the Anderson Trust, that huge cache of money that is used for covert purposes under the supervision of people that are basically the progeny of the robber barons. And there is, on the other hand, this MJ12 group that it's not clear at the present time whether there's an overlap between the Anderson Trust people governing the political funds that are used for covert operations and what is the progeny of the Majestic 12 group. But they certainly are in communication with each other. They certainly have a relationship of some sort. And that is, in fact, who the, quote, deep state is, unbeknownst to President-elect Trump, who thinks that the deep state is just the bureaucracy, in the major executive branch agencies, whom he's threatening to disembowel by firing 2/3 of all of that's not going to get at the deep state. So this is the deep state. The deep state are the people that assassinated President Kennedy. The deep state are the people that are keeping the darkest secrets about the UFOs, and that they're the ones that are still in control, deeply buried, of the United States democracy, that have to be dug out, identified, and put out of business if we're going to secure control of our own democratic future.
Thank you, Danny. You're a fountainhead of knowledge and would say deep wisdom. And so I really want to express on behalf of all of us our deep appreciation for all you do and all of who you are. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that, Jim. Thanks. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the time. Sorry about it being such an intense drink out of a fire hose, but that's why we record these things, so you can kind of play through it and say, what was that? What did he say? Yeah. Okay. So I appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everyone. That'll bring us to a close for today. We'll see you all tomorrow on Humanity Rising for a discussion with Larry Wilkerson, the former chief of staff to Colin Powell in the State Department, and when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, about latest developments in Ukraine and the Middle East and the implications of the new hypersonic missile developed by Russia and deployed called the Orechnik. Thanks. Bye for now.